All right then. Anyway, this presentation is on the recent developments with the device drivers that Arkanoa is working on. Some of you may have already heard some of this information, but what I did is I tried to include anything that happened since the last Warpstock Europe. So let's get going and see if we can create some controversy. Do you see the slides? Very good. There's a lot of confusion going on around your system's BIOS, what it does and what uses it and what doesn't use it, and whether or not it's going away. Well, it's not going away. The only thing that's changing is the interface to it. So whatever you call it, UEFI, BIOS, or whatever, it'll always be there because it's what runs when you turn on the power switch. So to avoid all this confusion and to talk about all this stuff that the vendor supplies with your computer, I'm just going to call it vendor supplied firmware. So it's what we used to call the BIOS, but it incorporates everything like the BIOS, the ACPI, some startup code. Maybe it's UEFI, maybe it's not. Maybe it has a CSM, maybe it doesn't. The point is, for most things, it just doesn't matter. The ACPI PSD, for example, doesn't use or depend on any of the old style BIOS stuff. It does depend on ACPI, however, which is in there. So anyway, just wanted to bring that up because I'll be mentioning that and you'll be hearing about that in other places. Let's move on to the ACPI driver project. Its current version is 3.23.11. Most of the recent changes have been to add features or fix problems that are elsewhere in the system. You know, even though the PSD is part of the ACPI project, driving the ACPI is only a small part of what the PSD does. It configures the system, it fixes up the PCI space based on, what the vendor supplied firmware did or didn't do. It patches the kernel, it adds system enhancements, it does a bunch of things. And we use the PSD to do these things because it is strategically located in the system and it loads very early in the boot process. It's essentially a kernel plugin. And it operates at roughly the same levels as the kernel, so it can do pretty much whatever the kernel does. So some of the recent changes have been to fix the kernel IPI timeout issue. Some of you may have already known about this. It was reported originally as the full screen hang problem, even though it really had absolutely nothing to do with full screen sessions. It actually was a lockup that occurred when the kernel was doing inter-process communications. So anyway, that was one of the things that got fixed. The things that determined it was really fast CPUs, in other words, greater than 3 gigahertz and having more than one of them. The other thing that got fixed was some GPE storms. Some of the vendor supplied firmware would get into loops generating constant interrupts to the system, which would basically hang the computer. So I put workarounds for that in as well. And there have been other enhancements to handle other problems with various firmware supplied by vendors. And of course, we always get the obligatory ACPI CA updates from Intel. There have also been some recent changes in the daemon, particularly involving power management. I changed the algorithm on how the power manager determines whether the CPU is busy or not, and it's now a lot more accurate. And it also handles if other applications try and turn the CPUs on and off via the kernel API. So it detects those and deals with it accordingly. Any questions on the ACPI stuff? Okay. Multimac has seen some work done on it. The current release is from November 26, 2018, and it includes all the drivers version 1.1.4 and the MMRL is version 0.1.3. Obviously, the Multimac release is a bundle of a bunch of different drivers, and each driver has their own version. So when you report things, make sure you report which version of the driver you're using, not the date of the bundle. One of the things that did get enhanced was memory management stuff, mainly to handle buffer stuff that transfers between the driver and the kernel. Some of these changes were also necessary to accommodate some of the newer drivers that got added. There is also some better inter-module dynamic linking. This is one of the things that the FreeBSD drivers do, is they link various modules together as they load. And this was also needed for some of the more newer drivers that got added to the pack. And I fixed a packet transmit deadlock issue. There was, under some very rare conditions on multi-CPU systems, where the driver would just stop because, well, there was a deadlock situation when transmitting packets. That got fixed. And there were improvements to the interrupt handlers. The interrupt handler is one of the places where there's a major difference between the way FreeBSD does things and the way OS2 does things. And just in case anybody didn't already know, all the Multimac drivers are essentially recompiled FreeBSD drivers. They're not exactly ported, they're simply compiled to run on OS2. And whatever minor changes are needed to make them run on OS2, that is done. And one of those minor changes is the interrupt handler. Any questions on Multimac? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, there is one from Keith. I'm going over here for the headset so you can understand him.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you.
Hi, Keith here. You said multi-CPU. Do you mean multi-core or multi-CPU?
Either way, if there's more than one CPU running, I consider it multi-CPU.
Okay.
It doesn't matter whether they're all in the same chip or if they're multiple chips. Doesn't matter at all.
Okay, clarified. Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, moving on to USB. The current version is 12.01. You'll be seeing this really soon. It has been really thoroughly tested, and it is the version that's going to be in Arca OS 5.0.4. Due out any time now, I understand. Version 12 has all 32-bit drivers except for audio and MSD. Those two are either planned or in progress to be converted to 32-bit drivers. The version 12 stack is significantly different than the old 16-bit stacks. They have faster code execution, mainly because you get a lot more work done with a 32-bit instruction than multiple 16-bit instructions. Large portions of the code has been completely rewritten or just gotten rid of because it's been replaced by common code in my Drive32 library. It has better memory management than the 16-bit drivers did. And it has better, faster inter-driver communications. Doesn't require any thunking, basically direct inter-driver calls. All of that means that there's a lot less overhead. The bottom line is that although the data transfer isn't any different between, across the USB bus, because we all know the USB bus is what it is, these drivers need less CPU time and less, basically just less computer resources to execute. So you'll see less CPU load when running them. Here's a picture of how the USB stuff kind of fits together. At the bottom, we have all of the host controller drivers, the OHCD, UHCD, EHCD, and XHCD drivers. These are what actually talk to the hardware, and all of those moving up the ladder talk to the USB-D, which is the USB driver. That is the major interface to all of the other class drivers. On the left-hand side, you'll see the human interface drivers, the mouse, keyboard, and the HID. And you'll notice the dotted box around the lower section, the host controller drivers in USB-D. All of those are a tightly coupled matched set. You cannot interchange any of those drivers with any other version. Also, the HID has a little dotted box around it. Those are all a tightly coupled matched set. You cannot swap out any of those with other versions either. And in addition, those two dotted boxes all have to be the 32-bit version 12 drivers. You cannot swap out any of those with other versions. Then you've got the class drivers up in the upper right-hand side, the printer driver, the COM driver, and the USB calls driver. Those are all 32-bit drivers now, and they all interface directly to the USB-D driver through the fast 32-bit direct call interface. The two kind of orphans are in pink, MSD and audio. They talk to USB-D through this little 16-bit compatibility wart tacked on the side of USB-D, just so that they are still able to be used. It's not quite as fast as the other stuff, but it still does work. So just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how all the USB stuff fits together. Now let's talk about something that is on everybody's mind, upcoming versions. The currently released test version to the test team is version 12.03. It contains the XHCI driver for USB 3. It is currently working and being tested. It currently works on every single system I have ever tried it on. However, I have heard that there are some issues with compatibility with certain Intel chipsets. Leave it to Intel to be incompatible. That's kind of usually the way it is. Intel hardware always takes the most amount of workarounds and complex code to get them working. The other thing that is still not implemented is isochronous support. And the reason that's still not done is because I've been trying to figure out what's wrong with the Intel hardware. Oh, and one other thing, sometimes error recovery doesn't quite work properly, so I'm still working on that. But other than that, the USB 3 stuff is built, it exists, and it works. As soon as I figure out the Intel problem, it'll probably go into final beta test, and then you should be able to see it. Any questions on USB? Nope, I don't see any hands. Oh. I'm sorry? Okay, display drivers. Let's talk about Panorama for a second. The current version is 1.13. It has had a few changes. There was a compatibility problem with a very rare thing with certain firmwares from vendors caused hangs in the driver. I've managed to track that down and fix it. That took some time. There have been some enhancement to the screen object. This doesn't affect the driver necessarily, but it's it's when you open the screen object, you can see, you can change some of the custom resolution settings and some of the other things. That's been enhanced a little bit. And one of the major things I did was I enhanced the protect mode interface. And this gave it a lot more compatibility with a more variety of systems. The protect mode interface that was provided by IBM was kind of complex and didn't always work in all situations. So I kind of modified that a little bit, and it gave us a better system that's more compatible. And the other thing I did is I enhanced the EDID capability or compatibility so that it'll recognize some of the newer monitors. It used to only detect up to version 1.3, and now we have 1.4. So it will detect those so it can get the resolution of those monitors as well. One of the other things involving display drivers is the grad.sys driver. A lot of times this gets forgotten because it tends to just work. However, there have been a few enhancements to that as well. The grad driver is used in all, the grad.sys is used in all of the grad drivers, Panorama, Snap, GenGrad, all of them. So it's kind of important common to them all. The current version is 2.01, and version 2.02 is in progress. Version 2.01 fixed a trap if the system didn't even have any MTRRs. And by the way, that's one of the major things that the grad.sys driver is responsible for, is setting the MTRRs in the system for video performance. It turned out there are some systems out there that don't have any MTRRs, and it was discovered that there was a defect in there that would cause a trap if they didn't have any. The other thing that is currently being worked on is apparently some of the newer firmware in some of these systems is already setting right combining for the display memory. So the video driver doesn't have to do it anymore. The newer version, which is not released yet, will detect if this has already happened and then not try and do it again. Interesting things people are doing, all these vendors are doing with their firmware these days. Any questions about display drivers? Okay then, moving.
Yeah, there's one question.
Yes.
Resolution, we have now seen high-res
No?
display.
Just a second, I'll relay the question in a moment.
Okay.
Go ahead. No, oh, she's coming here.
Hi, Sandra, Heike here. We are now seeing more and more high-res displays, and the older drivers only supported roughly 2K by 1.5K, or if two monitors were combined, you could get two Full HD screens side by side. Could Panorama pass this and support 4K displays, or would you have to reduce it somehow?
Well, Panorama is a VISA-based driver. It doesn't really have any limits or requirements other than what is imposed by the VISA BIOS. So it will be able to do whatever the VISA BIOS does that's in the particular hardware. I know that doesn't really answer a question very well, but that's really the real answer. Panorama does not limit you to any particular size of screen, and it does not limit you to any number of monitors. It's whatever the BIOS can do. That's what Panorama is for. Panorama is for. If you need multi-head displays and bigger displays than what the BIOS can handle, if there is a BIOS, a video BIOS anymore, then you'll need actually a hardware driver, something like Snap. Does that make sense? Okay, moving on. Disk drivers. The AHCI driver, current version is 2.06. And what changed in that since the last Warpstock was the IOC-TL interface for the smart utilities got fixed. That apparently wasn't working. I removed some startup restrictions, primarily because some firmware didn't set up things quite right. Even though the driver would still work, it was detecting certain problems in the PCI configuration. So I just decided to ignore those things, go ahead and load and run anyway. A major thing that got added in this most recent version is a feature to ignore unusable disks. And what this feature does is it reads the first sector on the disk and it tries to determine if it's an MBR style disk or if it's been wiped. And those are the only two conditions which cause it to be a usable disk. It must have an MBR disk structure or it must be wiped. Otherwise, it'll just ignore the disk. And what this is for is to prevent accidental damage to non-MBR disks, like GPT disks and stuff like that. And also, I cleaned up some of the debug output messages that you might have seen in some of the test log outputs. That's going to be cleaner now with this version. Any questions on AHCI? Nope. Very good. Other stuff I've been working on. The test log program is obviously a very important thing. It provides the developer with a comprehensive log of your system. It's actually pretty invasive. It goes and queries all kinds of stuff and pretty much gives the developer a full inventory of everything in your system, how it's working, what's not working. There have been enhancements and upgrades to it, so make sure you always use the latest version. We always say that, but it never hurts to remind everybody. But one thing that people seem to forget is that running it clears all the debug buffers, which means you only can run it once per boot. Because if you run it once just to kind of see if it works, and then run it a second time to actually produce the log, well, you lost all the debug data, and it really is not very useful. And the other thing that you always want to make sure you can do if possible is run the test log program when the problem actually exists, if you can. I mean, obviously, if you get a trap or something, you can't. But you know, if like the network has stopped, well, run it when the network has stopped. That way it can capture the state of the system when the problem actually exists. Anyway, so that about covers the driver stuff that I've been working on, but how many people would like to see more driver development work? Nobody, huh? Well, one person in the back, 2 people, 3 people, there we go, 4 or 5, yeah, lots of people. More driver development would be good because there's a lot of projects that we want to work on and want to get done, and a lot of work to be done. However, here's how my time gets used up. Handling tickets and other problems, which is not just dealing with tickets, but problems get reported and need to be fixed, or things come up, different hardware comes up and it doesn't work and that needs to be fixed, or enhancements and things. That's sort of the big time consumer. However, there are parts of tickets that do take up a lot of time when people don't read the best practices page. The other thing that takes up my time is, you know, preparing Warpstock presentations, reading emails, meetings, you know, other things like getting the next version of Arca OS out and stuff like that. And then we have customer support, not customer support, corporate customer support. And this thing is important because corporate customers maintain OS2 relevance and use in the world. And it also provides income for Arcanoa. And then after all of that stuff is done, whatever time's left over gets into writing XHCI or disk drivers or, you know, wireless drivers and all of that. Now do the math here real quick. Add those up. Sometimes, which is partly why you don't see a whole lot of really rapid progress on some things. What you can do to help this, what people can do to help this a little bit, is if you have problems, read the docs and the readmes and the wikis, and do as much of the work as you can before opening a ticket. Make sure your problem's reproducible. Read the best practices page. You know, if there's not a whole lot of developers developing for OS2 these days, so if we have to spend a lot of time reading tickets and searching for, oh, where's the test log file, or where's the trap screen, or where's this, or where's that, and then I have to ask for it and then wait back for a reply, that just wastes our time. So try and do as much of the work as you can to help the developers out as much as possible. And it really will save a lot of time. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. I can take some questions if you guys like.
The status of wireless LAN
Yeah,
or Wi-Fi.
wireless LAN is still on the list to be done. We figured people would want USB 3 first. And then there's this thing called NVMe-E, which is probably going to be pretty important. So yeah, it's on the list. If anybody has some good cloning technology, maybe that would work. What's that?
Somebody suggested a voting system so we can vote what gets done first. Wi-Fi, USB 3, NVMe, whatever, or clone you.
Yeah, well, we try and determine what comes next based on what's really important. Like, for example, if we're starting to see systems being developed with firmware that just won't boot anymore, then we kind of need to address that first, and that may involve PSD development or something like that. Or in the case of the UEFI stuff, it might involve that. Because we figure something like wireless support doesn't even come into play if your system won't boot. And then what if we start suddenly have systems that have disks that don't have AHCI anymore? They've all got NVMe. Well, if you can't boot your system yet again, then Wi-Fi doesn't matter either, and we got to deal with the disk stuff. So, and then we've got, you know, corporate customers and things that actually pay a bunch of money for licenses and things, and what their priorities are matters as well, what gets worked on first. So, you know, we try and prioritize things the best as possible, assuming that everything can't get done all at once. If we had 100 developers, yeah, everything could get done all at once, but we don't. All right, guys, thanks a lot. Wish I could have been there, but I guess this is the next best thing. You bet. All right. Bye.
And I'm going to give you my presentation on the care and feeding of Firefox. Huh?
You've had some work done.
Yeah. I've gotten taller. Is it shorter?
You like cats?
Pardon?
You like cats?
Yes.
Okay. And you'll speak.
Well, in everything that says Steve Levine and Associates, I'm the Associates. Next slide. Okay. First of all, a little summary about what Firefox is. First of all, just for your interest, we really legally can't call it Firefox because this is a port. And so it has to be called something else, which is something they're looking at right now. Firefox, I doubt, is ever going to come after us, or the Mozilla Foundation is ever going to come after us. But just a little aside on that, because it's obviously a Mozilla Foundation browser. Of course, it's based on one of the extended release cycles, which means that they didn't change the number for 4 days instead of the usual 2. And what it really means is they still are, I think support has been dropped for this particular one, but they were still making bug fixes for a more prolonged period of time after they had moved on to 46. And it was basically, this first existed in April of 2017. So it is getting a little old. There are a couple of different versions of it out at this point. Bitwise Works, for good reason, stopped working on it so that they could move on to Qt5. And what work is being done on it is being done by Dave Yale. And these are the places you can get them. I recommend you use Dave's builds, because he has worked out a few of the bugs. And the one that's SUA1, what he did was he ported some security fixes from the old Mac operating system version, which is also stuck on the 45.9, but they had brought in some security fixes, and he went back and picked up all those security fixes. So this browser is more secure. One other note on this, though, I read his post from a couple of days ago, and I also experienced it. The SUA1 traps on certain websites. There is an SUA2, which the last time I checked wasn't up on Bitbucket, but he had said that he fixed the trap and built it. So if you go out and get it, you want the SUA2 version, rather than take all the time to download the one just to find out that you need to upgrade it. Obviously, what you want to look at is the RPM requirements, and make sure you have them all. If you're upgrading from 30, 38, whatever we currently have on with ArcOS, there's one library that you have to upgrade, or you have to get, which is libvx something, in order to install it and have it run. There may be some other optional things that have to do with the multimedia stuff that you want to get. But just make sure you read all the requirements and check on all of those sorts of things. The 7-zip and the RPM version both get installed into the Unix root tree on your drives, and you pretty much have to accept that. If you don't want to do that, or if you're going to just install it where you have it currently installed, you'll want to get the zip file version. And again, like I said, you'll probably want to get Dave's, and I believe it only comes as a zip file version. And instructions for installing from RPM, it's really pretty straightforward. You open Argonaut package manager pointed at Firefox and tell it to install it. And it, of course, will get all your dependencies and everything for you. That's the one advantage of using it. I also saw that they're working on, well, I'll get to that in a minute. They're working on an installer which will do some of this for you. You want to get high mem or header or exe header. Exe header is actually automatically installed by Arc OS, and high mem is in the open office tree. Both of them, what they do is they mark the DLLs so that they can be loaded up into high memory. This, with this particular version, is essentially what you're going to have to do. You get, depending on what else you're running, you'll get anywhere from 48 to maybe 100 hours of uptime before it'll exhaust your low memory, and you'll have to get to reboot and start over again. And the only workaround is to put the DLLs up into high memory. The problem with that is that you can't unload them. Well, you can unload them, but the memory that they use doesn't get freed. And that's a kernel defect. So if you constantly load them and unload them, you'll exhaust high memory. There's a workaround, though, fortunately, for that. Dave Yeo has created a set of Moz turbo utilities. You're probably all familiar with that because number of years ago there was a Moz turbo, and what it's designed to do is just make Firefox load or the Mozilla browsers load faster, because what it does is it preloads all the DLLs. Well, the advantage to it at this point, and there's one, you see the one that's FF turbo, there's also an SM turbo and a TB turbo. And you can actually load all three of them from your startup folder at the same time. I happen to load Firefox and SeaMonkey, both of them. And what that does is you now have your DLLs marked to load high. The turbos load them, but when you run SeaMonkey, it just uses them. But when you close SeaMonkey, it doesn't unload the DLLs because the turbos are still holding them in memory. And that way, the problem with the fact that the memory doesn't get released essentially goes away, because you're never asking it to be released. And there are people that are running all three of them, the turbos for all three of them simultaneously, and I haven't seen reports of any problems at all. I've had SeaMonkey running continuously for over a month without a trap and without exhausting my memory since I started doing this. And you can see, you want to create a program object. It's better to detach it, that way you don't see it on your program lists and things like that. That in and of itself isn't essential. The dash or the -L it just means load. And it doesn't load the DLLs entirely. It just reserves the memory for them, basically. There's also a -T, which is the actual turbo, and it fully loads all of them. So if you're doing it just for the memory problem, the -L is fine. If you're doing it because you want to try to speed the loading of the first time you load SeaMonkey or Firefox, you should use the -T. It's always a good idea to start with a new profile. It's something that I violate every time. So far I've gotten away with it, but it's still a good idea. And if you do have problems when you initially start it up, you do want to go ahead and start with a new that's the first thing to do, is to create a new profile and make sure that that doesn't just fix your problem. Okay, these are some preferences that at least Stephen uses. Since I don't bother to go in and set any of them, or if I set them 10 years ago, I will just simply take his word for that, for these particular parameters. There's also in Firefox a problem with heavy processor usage, that the processor will spike. And there are several reasons that that has happened. One of them relates to the Firefox theme, its default theme. People have said that if you change the theme to one of the ones listed here, that tends to get rid of the CPU spikes. Also, there have been reports that if you start loading a browser page and then immediately minimize Firefox, that will do it. That you'll, even after the page has loaded, it will continue spiking. So you don't want to quickly do that. Adblock Ultimate, I don't use it. What I recommend is the hosts file. You can go out and look on, just search for ad blocking hosts file, and you'll be able to pull up the site for that. And all you do is just put that in as your host file. And what it does is it's a huge long list of all the different ad related sites. And it basically aliases them to the address 0.0.0.0, which of course is nowhere. And so you don't get taken to those sites. And it works very nicely. The only kind of drawback is you'll have to go out and re-update it periodically to get the latest and the greatest.
The advantage of using that one over the ad blocker is that there are a lot of websites which detect if you're using ad blocker and won't let you in or will complain at you. Most of them, at least that I've encountered, don't detect the host files, right?
And this is a list of places to find extensions, and this is important to us because the main Mozilla extension site is of no value to us anymore because they don't have anything on it that will work with this old version of Firefox. So you want to check out some of these other sites. Again, this is a set of recommended settings. I can't speak to whether they're any faster or not, but particularly if you're frustrated by the rate at which your pages load, it's probably worth trying them to see if they do improve the speed. The 100% CPU utilization, or the CPU spikes, obviously is a known issue. It probably relates to a change. VGA has a feature called VSync, which it tells the computer when it's starting to load a frame. And if you time loading of everything or repaints in the browsers to that frame, everything runs more smoothly. The problem is OS2 has no idea what that is. And Lars actually looked at the possibility of creating a driver for it and found out that some VGA cards don't actually support it. So nobody could ever figure it out. So basically they turned it off, but a lot of the code sort of expects it. So that was one of the issues. And for that reason, if you leave a site with animated GIFs as the tab that's viewable, doesn't matter whether you can actually see it. In other words, it can be on a completely different page or page. It doesn't have to be on the screen, but that's the one out, that will cause the spikes too. And the solution is simple: switch to another tab, and they go away. But that relates to that vsync issue. And then the theme, which also might relate to it because it's potentially a painting issue. And like I said before, don't minimize Firefox while it's doing stuff. You know, it's always wonderful to go on the site where they're developing the software. This is on GitHub. GitHub throws a banner across the top of Firefox telling you that you've got an out-of-date browser and that it's not supported. There it doesn't really matter because I can just hit a button that says ignore, it goes away, and GitHub works fine. But you may want to override the user agent. Same thing for logon issues. You know, sometimes, yeah, they really do need the newer functionality. Sometimes I suppose they're just concerned about security issues, because obviously these browsers aren't as secure as the new ones, or at least as people think the new ones are. These are a couple of links that just will give you more information about setting up profiles, about what the different user settings mean, those sorts of things. So, thank you. And it is beautiful here in Southern California. Any questions? Yeah.
German localization?
I think so. I think you can use the one that you can use the actual one for the actual Firefox of that age from any of them.
I've got, well, I know I've built multiple language zips of Firefox 38, and 45 uses the same system. So
Yeah, I can't think of any reason that there isn't. I don't know where they are, but
Dat is dan niet beamer. Okay, well, 20 years of Warpstock Europe. Who would have thought that 20 years ago we would still be around? To put it simple, we got a couple of Looney Tunes walking around, crazy people, but they keep going. I think that deserves a lot of respect. I mean, I think it's admirable that we're getting a UEFI loader, that a new browser is on its way. And the only thing I always keep saying is that, you know, while I can understand questions coming out of the community with the sponsorship campaign for the browser, you know, stop asking what can go wrong. You know, you have absolutely no guarantee in 2010 you will be running OS2 in 2019. That's the fact of life. So I enjoy doing Warpstock. Alex Taylor and Greg Young, thank you for flying in. They came halfway around the world. We have a comfortable short journey time, but Greg flew from Utah, which was about a 10-hour flight, and Alex came from Toronto. He'll probably be completely jet lagged when he gets back and mentally toasted. Huh? Oh, what? So I said it yesterday. If people are interested in having Warpstock organized somewhere in Germany, I'm willing to listen, but I would really need some help with that. You've seen it with this hotel here. You would have hoped that the Ethernet plugs would have worked. I sent emails twice, you don't get a reply, and then you need to go on site and just test it yourself. We did get it to work, but it's kind of hilarious that my mobile phone works better than the Wi-Fi network. That's what it amounts to. So, are there any questions regarding what OS2 voice should do? Or you think just please move onward and just keep doing what you do? I'll certainly look forward doing Warpstock. I'm potentially looking to get some funding for Java 8. Some people approached me and said, we want Java 8. There might be some money available for that, or another version of Java. And that's I guess that's all we can do. Are there any questions? Yes?
Just one comment. Voice should have a reasonably new version of PM Mail in the not too distant future. I fixed the libcn issue with it, and now just have to wait until Neil, who's actually runs the project, decides exactly how he wants to do the releases. They're talking about releasing everything up to my changes, and then turning around again and releasing my changes with the new libc dependency.
Okay, yeah.
So probably sometime in the next month you can look for PM Mail. The reason it kind of had to be done is the combination of the libc, the new libc, and something in mail messages, because I haven't found the broken message yet, because it's a trap when it was loading folders.
Okay, thanks for fixing another bug. There are probably plenty left, but
Well, there'll be plenty left,
That-
because there's some of the major things that people probably want I'm not going to touch.
no, I've seen the discussion where we've been considering implementing IMAP and full HTML rendering, but
I'm not doing those.
no.
I'm sure you can already do IMAP and PM Mail. You just need to run a fetch mail service and then set PM Mail to a local queue. Fetch Mail downloads the IMAP messages to a local directory, and PM Mail.
I never thought of
there,
that,
but
so
it's not really smooth.
no. See, there it goes. If you already say it in such a fashion, it will probably just annoy users. Anyway, people listening on the stream, thank you for asking questions. We did get some donations. If you go to os2voice.org/membership HTML, you can help cover the cost of the conference. And I'd like to thank you all for coming, and see you next year, and thank you for coming.
Thanks for organizing.
Yes, thank you.